Part 2 of The Creature from Cleveland Depths by Fritz Leiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Greg Marguerite. Part 2 of The Creature from Cleveland Depths by Fritz Leiber. Chapter 5. Next day, Daisy cashed the microcheck for 1,000 silver smackers, which she hid in a broken radionic coffee urn. Gusterson sold his insanity novel, and started a new one about a mad medic with a hiccupy, hysterical chuckle who gimmicked mood masters to turn mental patients into nymphomaniacs, mass murderers, and compulsive saints. But this time he couldn't get Fay out of his mind, or the last chilling words the nervous little man had spoken. For that matter, he couldn't blank the underground out of his mind as effectively as usual. He had the feeling that a new kind of mole was loose in the burrows, and that the ground at the foot of their skyscraper might start humping up any minute. Toward the end of one afternoon, he tucked a half-dozen newly typed sheets in his pocket, shrouded his typer, went to the hat rack, and took down his prize, a miner's hardtop cap with electric headlamp. "Going below, Cap'n," he shouted toward the kitchen. "Be back for second dog watch," Daisy replied. "Remember what I told you about lassoing me some art-conscious girl neighbors?" "Only if I meet a piebald one with a taste for scotch. Or maybe a pearl gray biped jaguar with violet spots," Gusterson told her, clapping on the cap with a "we who are about to die" gesture. Halfway across the park to the escalator bunker, Gusterson's heart began to tick. He resolutely switched on his headlamp. As he'd known it would, the hatch robot whirred an extra higher pitched 10 seconds when it came to his topside address, but it ultimately dilated the hatch for him, first handing him a claim check for his ID card. Gusterson's heart was ticking like a sledgehammer by now. He hopped clumsily onto the escalator, clutching the moving guardrail to either side, then shut his eyes as the steps went over the edge and became what felt like vertical. An instant later he forced his eyes open, unclipped a hand from the rail, and touched the second switch beside his headlamp, which instantly began to blink whitely, as if he were a civilian plane flying into a nest of military jobs. With a further effort he kept his eyes open and flinchingly surveyed the scene around him. After zigging through a bomb-proof half-furlong of roof, he was dropping into a large twilit cave. The blue-black ceiling twinkled with stars. The walls were pierced at floor level by a dozen archways, with busy niche stores and glowing advertisements crowded between them. From the archways, some 36 sidewalks curved out, tangenting off each other in a bewildering multiple cloverleaf. The sidewalks were packed with people, traveling motionless like purposeful statues, or pivoting with practiced grace from one sidewalk to another, like 1,000 torero doing Veronicas. The sidewalks were moving faster than he recalled from his last venture underground, and at the same time the whole pedestrian concourse was quieter than he remembered. It was as if the 5,000 or so moles in view were all listening. For what? But there was something else that had changed about them, a change that he couldn't for a moment define, or unconsciously didn't want to. Clothing style? No. My God, they were all wearing identical monster masks? No. Hair color? Well, he was studying them so intently that he forgot his escalator was landing. He came off it with a heel-jarring stumble and bumped into a knot of 4 men on the tiny triangular hold-still. These 4 at least sported a new style wrinkle: ribbed gray shoulder capes that made them look as if their heads were poking up out of the center of bulgy umbrellas or giant mushrooms. One of them grabbed hold of Gusterson and saved him from staggering onto a sidewalk that might have carried him to Toledo. "Gussie, you dog! You must have ESP'd. I wanted to see you," Fay cried, patting him on the elbows. "Meet Davidson and Kester and Hazen, colleagues of mine. We're all micromen." Fay's companions were staring strangely at Gusterson's blinking headlamp. Fay explained rapidly. "Mr. Gusterson is an insanity novelist. You know, ID." "Inner-directed spells id," Gusterson said absently, still staring at the interweaving crowd beyond them, trying to figure out what made them different from last trip. Creativity fuel, cranky. Explodes through the parietal fissure if you look at it cross-eyed." "Ha ha!" Fay laughed. "Well, boys, I've found my man. How's the new novel perking, Gussie?" "Got my climax, I think," Gusterson mumbled, still peering puzzledly around Fay at the slidestanders. "Moodmaster's going to come alive. Ever occur to you that mood is doom spelled backwards? And then—" He let his voice trail off as he realized that Kester and Davidson and Hazen had made their farewells and were sliding into the distance. He reminded himself wryly that nobody ever wants to hear an author talk. He's much too good a listener to be wasted that way. Let's see, was it that everybody in the crowd had the same facial expression, or showed symptoms of the same disease? "I was coming to visit you, but now you can pay me a call," Fay was saying. "There are two matters I want to—" Gusterson stiffened. "My God, they're all hunchbacked!" he yelled. "Shh! Of course they are," Fay whispered reprovingly. "They're all wearing their ticklers, but you don't need to be insulting about it." "I'm getting out of here." Gusterson turned to flee as if from 5,000 Richard III's. "Oh, no, you're not," Fay amended, drawing him back with one hand. Somehow, underground, the little man seemed to carry more weight. "You're having cocktails in my thinking box. Besides, climbing a down escalator will give you a heart attack." In his home habitat, Gusterson was about as easy to handle as a rogue rhinoceros. But away from it, and especially if underground, he became more like a pliable elephant. All his bones dropped out through his feet, as he described it to Daisy. So now he submitted miserably as Fay surveyed him up and down, switched off his blinking headlamp — "That coal miner caper is corny, Gussie" — and then, surprisingly rapidly, stuffed his belt bag under the right shoulder of Gusterson's coat and buttoned the latter to hold it in place. "So you won't stand out," he explained. Another swift survey. "You'll do. Come on, Gussie, I've got lots to brief you on." 3 rapid paces, and then Gusterson's feet would have gone out from under him, except that Fay gave him a mighty shove. The small man sprang onto the slidewalk after him, and then they were skimming effortlessly side by side. Gusterson felt frightened and twice as hunchbacked as the slidestanders around him, morally as well as physically. Nevertheless, he countered bravely. "I got things to brief you on. I got 6 pages of cautions on Shh!" Fay stopped him. "Let's use my hush box." He drew out his pancake phone and stretched it so that it covered both their lower faces like a double yashmak. Gunderson, his neck pushing into the ribbed bulge of the shoulder cape so he could be cheek to cheek with Fay, felt horribly conspicuous. But then he noticed that none of the slidestanders were paying them the least attention. The reason for their abstraction occurred to him. They were listening to their ticklers. He shuddered. "I got 6 pages of caution on ticklers," he repeated into the hot, moist quiet of the pancake phone. "I typed 'em so I wouldn't forget 'em in the heat of polemicking. I want you to read every word, Fay. I've had it on my mind ever since I started wondering whether it was you or your tickler made you duck out of our place last time you were there. I want you to—" "All in good time." In the pancake phone, Fay's laugh was brassy. "But I'm glad you've decided to lend a hand, Gussie. This thing is moving fast. Nationwide, adult underground ticklerization is 90% complete." "I don't believe that," Gusterson protested, while glaring at the hunchbacks all around them. The slidewalk was gliding down a low, glow-ceiling tunnel lined with doors and advertisements. Rapt-eyed people were pirouetting on and off. A thing just can't develop that fast, Fay. It's against nature." "But we're not in nature. We're in culture. The progress of an industrial scientific culture is geometric. It goes n times as many jumps as it takes. More than geometric, exponential. Confidently, Micro's math chief tells me we're currently on a 4th power progress curve, trending into a 5th. "You mean we're going so fast we got to watch out we don't bump ourselves in the rear when we come around again?" Gusterson asked, scanning the tunnel ahead for curves. "Or just shoot straight up to infinity?" "Exactly. Of course, most of the last power and a half is due to Tickler itself. Gussie, the Ticklers already eliminated absenteeism, alcoholism, abulia in numerous urban areas, and that's just one letter of the alphabet. If Tickler doesn't turn us into a nation of photo memory constant creative flow geniuses in 6 months, I'll come live topside." "You mean because a lot of people are standing around glassy-eyed listening to something mumbling in their ear that it's a good thing?" "Gussie, you don't know progress when you see it. Tickler is the greatest invention since language, bar none. It's the greatest instrument ever devised for integrating a man into all phases of his environment. Under the present routine, a newly purchased tickler first goes to government and civilian defense for primary patterning, then to the purchaser's employer, then to his doctor, psycher, then to his local bunker captain, then to him. Everything that's needful for a man's welfare gets on the spools. Efficiency cubed. Incidentally, Russia's got the tickler now. Our dip satellites have photographed it. It's like ours, except the commies wear it on their left shoulder. But they're 2 weeks behind us in development, and they'll never close the gap." Gusterson reared up out of the pancake phone to take a deep breath. A sulky-lipped, sylph-figured girl 2 feet from him twitched. Medium cooch, he judged. Then fumbled in her belt bag for a pill and popped it in her mouth. "Hell, the tickler's not even efficient yet about little things," Gusterson blatted, diving back into the privacy yashmak he was sharing with Fay. "Why didn't that girl's doctor have the Moodmaster component of her tickler inject her with medicine?" "Her doctor probably wants her to have the discipline of pill taking, or the exercise," Fay answered glibly. "Look sharp now. Here's where we fork. I'm taking you through Micro's postern." A ribbon of slidewalk split itself from the main band and angled off into a short alley. Gusterson hardly felt the constant speed juncture as they crossed it. Then the secondary ribbons speeded up, carrying them at about 30 feet a second toward the blank concrete wall in which the alley ended. Gusterson prepared to jump, but Fay grabbed him with one hand and with the other held up toward the wall a badge and a button. When they were about 10 feet away, the wall whipped aside, then whipped shut behind them so fast that Gusterson wondered momentarily if he still had his heels and the seat of his pants. Fay, tucking away his badge and pancake phone, dropped the button in Gunderson's vest pocket. "Use it when you leave," he said casually. "That is, if you leave." Gusterson, who was trying to read the do and don't posters papering the walls they were passing, started to probe that last sinister supposition, but just then the ribbon slowed, a swinging door opened and closed behind them, and they found themselves in a luxuriously furnished thinking box, measuring at least 8 feet by 5. "Hey, this is something," Gusterson said appreciatively to show he wasn't an utter yokel. Then, drawing on research he'd done for period novels, "Why, it's as big as a Pullman car compartment or a first mate's cabin in the War of 1812. You really must rate." Fay nodded, smiling wanly, and sat down with a sigh on a compact overstuffed swivel chair. He let his arms dangle and his head sink into his puffed shoulder cape. Gusterson stared at him. It was the first time he could ever recall the little man showing fatigue. "Tickler currently does have one serious drawback," Fay volunteered. "It weighs 28 pounds. You feel it when you've been on your feet a couple of hours. No question we're going to give the next model that anti-gravity feature you mentioned for pursuit grenades. We'd have had it in this model except that there were so many other things to be incorporated." He sighed again. "Why, the scanning and decision-making elements alone tripled the mass." "Hey," Gunderson protested, thinking especially of the sulky-lipped girl. "Do you mean to tell me all those other people were toting 2 stone?" Fay shook his head heavily. "They were all wearing Mark III or IV. I'm wearing Mark VI," he said, as one might say. "I'm carrying the genuine cross, not one of the balsa ones." But then his face brightened a little, and he went on. "Of course the new improved features make it more than worth it, and you hardly feel it at all at night when you're lying down. And if you remember to talcum under it twice a day, no sores develop, at least not very big ones." Backing away involuntarily, Gusterson felt something prod his right shoulder blade. Ripping open his coat, he convulsively plunged his hand under it and tore out Fay's belt bag, and then set it down very gently on the top of a shallow cabinet and relaxed with the sigh of one who has escaped a great if symbolic danger. Then he remembered something Fay had mentioned. He straightened again. "Hey, you said it's got scanning and decision-making elements. That means your tickler thinks, even by your fancy standards. And if it thinks, It's conscious." "Gussie," Fay said wearily, frowning, "all sorts of things nowadays have S&DM elements. Mail sorters, missiles, robot medics, high-style mannequins, just to name some of them is. They think to use that archaic word, but it's neither here nor there, and they're certainly not conscious." "Your tickler thinks," Gusterson repeated stubbornly. "Just like I warned you it would. It sits on your shoulder, riding you like it was a pony or a starved St. Bernard. And now it thinks." "Suppose it does," Fay yawned. "What of it?" He gave a rapid, sinuous, one-sided shrug that made it look for a moment as if his left arm had 3 elbows. It stuck in Gunderson's mind, for he had never seen Fay use such a gesture, and he wondered where he'd picked it up. Maybe imitating a double-jointed microfinance chief. Fay yawned again and said, "Please, Gussie, don't disturb me for a minute or so." His eyes half closed. Gusterson studied Fay's sunken-cheeked face and the great puff of his shoulder cape. "Say, Fay," he asked in a soft voice after about 5 minutes, "are you meditating?" "Why, no," Fay responded, starting up and then stifling another yawn. "Just resting a bit. I seem to get more tired these days, somehow. You'll have to excuse me, Gussie, but what made you think of meditation?" "Oh, I just got to wondering in that direction," Gusterson said. "You see, when you first started to develop Tickler, it occurred to me that there was one thing about it that might be real good, even if you did give it S&DM elements. It's this: having a mech secretary to take charge of his obligations and routines in the real world might allow a man to slide into the other world, the world of thoughts and feelings and intuitions, and sort of ooze around in there and accomplish things. Know any of the people using Tickler that way, eh?" "Of course not," Fay denied with a bright, incredulous laugh. "Who'd want to loaf around in an imaginary world and take a chance of missing out on what his Tickler's doing? I mean, on what his Tickler has in store for him. What he's told his Tickler to have in store for him." Ignoring Gusterson's shiver, Fay straightened up and seemed to brisken himself. "That little slump did me good. A Tickler makes you rest, you know. It's one of the great things about it. Pooh-Bah's kinder to me than I ever was to myself." He buttoned open a tiny refrigerator and took out 2 waxed cardboard cubes and handed one to Gusterson. "Martini? Hope you don't mind drinking it from the carton. Cheers. Now, Gussie, old pal, there are 2 matters I want to take up with you." "Hold it," Gusterson said with something of his old authority. "There's something I got to get off my mind first." He pulled the typed pages out of his inside pocket and straightened them. "I told you about these," he said. "I want you to read them before you do anything else. Here." Fay looked toward the pages and nodded, but did not take them yet. He lifted his hands to his throat and unhooked the clasp of his cape, then hesitated. "You wear that thing to hide the hump your Tickler makes," Gusterson filled in. "You got better taste than those other moles." "Not to hide it exactly," Fay protested, "but just so the others won't be jealous. I wouldn't feel comfortable parading a free-scanning, decision-capable Mark 6 Tickler in front of people who can't buy it until it goes on open sale at 22:15 tonight. Lot of shelter folk won't be sleeping tonight. They'll be queued up to trade in their old Tickler for a Mark 6 almost as good as Pooh-Bah." He started to jerk his hands apart, hesitated again with an oddly apprehensive look at the big man, then whirled off the cape. Chapter 6. Gusterson sucked in such a big gasp that he hiccuped. The right shoulder of Fay's jacket and shirt had been cut away. Thrusting up through the neatly hemmed hole was a silvery gray hump with a one-eyed turret atop it and 2 multi-jointed metal arms ending in little claws. It looked like the top half of a pseudoscience robot, a squat, evil child robot, Gusterson told himself, which had lost its legs in a railway accident, and it seemed to him that a red fleck was moving around imperceptibly in the huge single eye. "I'll take that memo now," Fay said coolly, reaching out his hand. He caught the rustling sheets as they slipped from Gusterson's fingers, evened them up very precisely by tapping them on his knee, and then handed them over his shoulder to his tickler, which clicked its claws around either margin and then began rather swiftly to lift the top sheet past its single eye at a distance of about 6 inches. "The first matter I want to take up with you, Gussie," Fay began, paying no attention whatsoever to the little scene on his shoulder, "or warn you about, rather, is the imminent ticklerization of school children, geriatrics, convicts, and topsiders. At 3:00 tomorrow, ticklers become mandatory for all adult shelter folk. The mop-up operations won't be long in coming. In fact, these days we find that the square root of the estimated time of a new development is generally the best time estimate. Gussie, I strongly advise you to start wearing a tickler now, and Daisy and your moppets. If you heed my advice, your kids will have the jump on your class. Transition and conditioning are easy, since Tickler itself sees to it." Pooh Bah leafed the first page to the back of the packet and began lifting the second page past his eye, a little more swiftly than the first. "I've got a Mark 6 tickler all warmed up for you," Fay pressed, "and a shoulder cape. You won't feel one bit conspicuous." He noticed the direction of Gusterson's gaze and remarked, "Fascinating mechanism, isn't it? Of course, 28 pounds are a bit oppressive, but then you have to remember it's only a way station to free-floating Mark 7 or 8. Pooh Bah finished page 2 and began to race through page 3. "But I wanted you to read it," Gusterson said bemusedly, staring. "Pooh Bah will do a better job than I could," Fay assured him. "Get the gist without losing the chaff." "But damn it, it's all about him," Gusterson said a little more strongly. "He won't be objective about it." "A better job," Fay reiterated, "and more fully objective. Pooh Bah's set for full precis. Stop worrying about it. He's a dispassionate machine, not a fallible, emotionally disturbed human misled by the will-o'-the-wisp of consciousness. Second matter. Micro Systems is impressed by your contributions to Tickler, and will recruit you as a senior consultant with a salary and thinking box as big as my own. Family quarters to match. It's an unheard of high start, Gussie. I think you'd be a fool—" He broke off, held up a hand for silence, and his eyes got a listening look. Pooh Bah had finished page 6 and was holding the packet motionless. After about 10 seconds, Fay's face broke into a big fake smile. He stood up, suppressing a wince, and held out his hand. "Gussie," he said loudly, "I am happy to inform you that all your fears about Tickler are so much thistledown. My word on it, there's nothing to them at all. Pooh Bah's precis, which he's just given to me, proves it." "Look," Gusterson said solemnly, "there's one thing I want you to do, purely to humor an old friend, but I want you to do it. Read that memo yourself." "Certainly I will, Gussie," Fay continued in the same ebullient tones. "I'll read it." He twitched and his smile disappeared. A little later." "Sure," Gusterson said dully, holding his hand to his stomach. "And now, if you don't mind, Fay, I'm going home. I feel just a bit sick. Maybe the ozone and the other additives in your shelter air are too heady for me. It's been years since I tramped through a pine forest." "But, Gussie, you've hardly got here. You haven't even sat down. Have another martini. Have a seltzer pill. Have a whiff of oxy. Have a—" "No, Fay. I'm going home right away. I'll think about the job offer. Remember, read that memo." "I will, Gussie. I certainly will. You know your way? The button takes you through the wall. Bye now." He sat down abruptly and looked away. Gusterson pushed through the swinging door. He tensed himself for the step across onto the slowly moving reverse ribbon. Then, on an impulse, he pushed ajar the swinging door and looked back inside. Fay was sitting as he'd left him, apparently lost in listless brooding. On his shoulder, Pooh Bah was rapidly crossing and uncrossing its little metal arms, tearing the memo to smaller and smaller shreds. It let the scraps drift slowly toward the floor and oddly writhed its 3-elbowed left arm. And then Gunderson knew from whom, or rather from what, Fay had copied his new shrug. Chapter 7. When Gusterson got home toward the end of the second dog watch, he slipped aside from Daisy's questions and set the children laughing with a graphic enactment of his slide-standing technique, and a story about getting his head caught in a thinking box built for a midget physicist. After supper he played with Imogene, Iago, and Claudius until it was their bedtime, and thereafter was unusually attentive to Daisy, admiring her fading green stripes, though he did spend a while in the next apartment, where they stored their outdoor camping equipment. But the next morning he announced to the children that it was a holiday, the feast of St. Gusterson, and then took Daisy into the bedroom and told her everything. When he'd finished she said, "This is something I've got to see for myself." Gusterson shrugged. "If you think you've got to, I say we should head for the hills right now. One thing I'm standing on: the kids aren't going back to school." "Agreed," Daisy said. "But, Gusterson, we've lived through a lot of things without leaving home altogether. We lived through the Everybody 6 Feet Underground by Christmas campaign, and the robot watchdog craze when you got your left foot half chewed off. We lived through the venomous bats, and the indoctrinated saboteur rats, and the hypnotized monkey paratrooper scares. We lived through the voice of safety, and the anti-communist somno instruction, and rightist pills, and jet-propelled vigilantes. We lived through the cold out, when you weren't supposed to turn on a toaster for fear its heat would be a target for prowl missiles, and when people with fevers were unpopular. We lived through—" Gusterson patted her hand. "You go below," he said. "Come back when you've decided this is different. Come back as soon as you can, anyway. I'll be worried about you every minute you're down there." When she was gone, in a green suit and hat to minimize, or at least justify, the effect of the faded stripes, Gusterson doled out to the children provender and equipment for a camping expedition to the next floor. Iago led them off in stealthy Indian file. Leaving the hall door open, Gusterson got out his .38 and cleaned and loaded it, meanwhile concentrating on a chess problem with the idea of confusing a hypothetical psionic monitor. By the time he had hid the revolver again, he heard the elevator creaking back up. Daisy came dragging in without her hat, looking as if she'd been concentrating on a chess problem for hours herself, and just now given up. Her stripes seemed to have vanished. Then Gusterson decided this was because her whole complexion was a touch green. She sat down on the edge of the couch and said without looking at him, "Did you tell me, Gusterson, that everybody was quiet and abstracted and orderly down below? Especially the ones wearing ticklers, meaning pretty much everybody?" "I did," he said. "I take it that's no longer the case. What are the new symptoms?" She gave no indication. After some time she said, "Gusterson, do you remember the Doré illustrations of the Inferno? Can you visualize the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch with the hordes of proto-Freudian devils tormenting people all over the farmyard and city square? Did you ever see the Disney animations of Mussorgsky's Witches' Sabbath music? Back in the foolish days before you married me, did that drug-addict girlfriend of yours ever take you to a genuine orgy?" "As bad as that, eh?" She nodded emphatically, and all of a sudden shivered violently. "Several shades worse," she said. "If they decide to come topside—" She shot up. "Where are the kids?" "Upstairs, camping in the mysterious wilderness of the 21st floor," Gusterson reassured her. "Let's leave 'em there until we're ready to—" He broke off. They both heard the faint sound of thudding footsteps. "They're on the stairs," Daisy whispered, starting to move toward the open door. "But are they coming from up or down?" "It's just one person," judged Gusterson, moving after his wife. "Too heavy for one of the kids." The footsteps doubled in volume and came rapidly closer. Along with them there was an agonized gasping. Daisy stopped, staring fearfully at the open doorway. Gusterson moved past her. Then he stopped too. Fay stumbled into view and would have fallen on his face except he clutched both sides of the doorway halfway up. He was stripped to the waist. There was a little blood on his shoulder. His narrow chest was arching convulsively, the ribs standing out starkly as he sucked in oxygen to replace what he'd burned up running up 25 flights. His eyes were wild. "They've taken over," he panted. Another gobbling breath. "Gone crazy." Two more gasps. "Gotta stop 'em." His eyes filmed. He swayed forward. Then Gusterson's big arms were around him and he was carrying him to the couch. Daisy came running from the kitchen with a damp, cool towel. Gusterson took it from her and began to mop Fay off. He sucked in his own breath as he saw that Fay's right ear was raw and torn. He whispered to Daisy, "Look at where that thing savaged him." The blood on Fay's shoulder came from his ear. Some of it stained a flush-skin plastic fitting that had two small valved holes in it and that puzzled Gusterson until he remembered that Moodmaster tied into the bloodstream. For a second he thought he was going to vomit. The dazed look slid aside from Fay's eyes. He was gasping less painfully now. He sat up, pushing the towel away, buried his face in his hands for a few seconds, then looked over the fingers at the two of them. "I've been living in a nightmare for the last week," he said in a taut, small voice. "Knowing the thing had come alive and trying to pretend to myself that it hadn't. Knowing it was taking charge of me more and more. Having it whisper in my ear over and over again in a cracked little rhyme that I could only hear every 100th time. Day by day, in every way, you're learning to listen and obey. Day by day." His voice started to go high. He pulled it down and continued harshly. "I ditched it this morning when I showered. It let me break contact to do that. It must have figured it had complete control of me, mounted or dismounted. I think it's telepathic. And then it did some, well, rather unpleasant things to me late last night. But I pulled together my fears and my will and I ran for it. The slidewalks were chaos. The Mark 6 ticklers showed some purpose, though I couldn't tell you what. But as far as I could see, the Mark 3s and 4s were just cooching their mounts to death. Chinese feather torture. Giggling, gasping, choking gales of mirth. People are dying of laughter. Ticklers! The irony of it! It was the complete lack of order and sanity, and that let me get topside. There were things I saw—" Once again his voice went shrill. He clapped his hand to his mouth and rocked back and forth on the couch. Gusterson gently but firmly laid a hand on his good shoulder. "Steady," he said. "Here, swallow this." Fay shoved aside the short brown drink. "We've got to stop them!" he cried. "Mobilize the topsiders, contact the wilderness patrols, and man satellites. Pour ether in the tunnel air pumps. Invent and crash manufacture missiles that will home on ticklers without harming humans. SOS Mars and Venus. Dope the shelter water supply. Do something! Gussie, you don't realize what people are going through down there every second." "I think they're experiencing the ultimate in outer directedness," Gusterson said gruffly. "Have you no heart?" Fay demanded. His eyes widened as if he were seeing Gusterson for the first time. Then, accusingly, pointing a shaking finger. "You invented the tickler, George Gusterson. It's all your fault. You've got to do something about it." Before Gusterson could retort to that, or begin to think of a reply, or even assimilate the full enormity of Fay's statement, he was grabbed from behind and frog-marched away from Fay, and something that felt remarkably like the muzzle of a large-caliber gun was shoved in the small of his back. Under cover of Fay's outburst, a huge crowd of people had entered the room from the hall. 8 to be exact. But the weirdest thing about them to Gusterson was that from the first instant he had the impression that only one mind had entered the room, and that it did not reside in any of the 8 persons, even though he recognized 3 of them, but in something that they were carrying. Several things contributed to this impression. The 8 people all had the same blank expression, watchful yet empty-eyed. They all moved in the same slithery crouch, and they all had taken off their shoes. Perhaps, Gusterson thought wildly, they believed he and Daisy ran a Japanese flat. Gusterson was being held by 2 burly women, one of them quite pimply. He considered stamping on her toes, but just at that moment the gun dug in his back with a corkscrew movement. The man holding the gun on him was Fay's colleague, Davidson. Some yards beyond Fay's couch, Kester was holding a gun on Daisy without digging it into her, while the single strange man holding Daisy herself was doing so quite decorously, a circumstance which afforded Gusterson minor relief, since it made him feel less guilty about not going berserk. 2 more strange men, one of them in purple lounging pajamas, the other in the gray uniform of a slidewalk inspector, had grabbed Fay's skinny upper arms, one on either side, and were lifting him to his feet while Fay was struggling with such desperate futility and gibbering so pitifully that Gusterson momentarily had second thoughts about the moral imperative to go berserk when menaced by hostile force. But again the gun dug into him with a twist. Approaching Fay face on was the third Micro-man Gusterson had met yesterday, Hazen. It was Hazen who was carrying, quite reverently or solemnly, or at any rate very carefully, the object that seemed to Gusterson to be the mind of the little storm troop presently desecrating the sanctity of his own individual home. All of them were wearing ticklers, of course. The three Micro-men, the heavy emergent Mark 6s with their clawed and jointed arms and monocular cephalic turrets. The rest lower numbered marks of the sort that merely made Richard III humps under clothing. The object that Hazen was carrying was the Mark 6 tickler Gusterson had seen Fay wearing yesterday. Gusterson was sure it was Pooh Bah because of its air of command, and because he would have sworn on a mountain of Bibles that he recognized the red fleck lurking in the back of its single eye. And Pooh Bah alone had the aura of full conscious thought. Pooh Bah alone had mana. It is not good to see an evil legless child robot with dangling straps bossing, apparently by telepathic power, not only 3 objects of its own kind and 5 close primitive relatives, but also 8 human beings, and in addition throwing into a state of twitching terror 1 miserable thin-chested half-crazy research and development director. Pooh Bah pointed a claw at Fay. Fay's handlers dragged him forward, still resisting, but more feebly now, as if half hypnotized, or at least cowed. Gusterson grunted an outraged "Hey!" and automatically struggled a bit, but once more the gun dug in. Daisy shut her eyes, then firmed her mouth and opened them again to look. Seating the tickler on Fay's shoulder took a little time, because 2 blunt spikes in the bottom had to be fitted into the valved holes in the flush-skin plastic disc. When at last they plunged home, Gusterson felt very sick indeed, and then even more so as the tickler itself poked a tiny pellet on a fine wire into Fay's ear. The next moment Fay had straightened up and motioned his handlers aside. He tightened the straps of his tickler around his chest and under his armpits, and he held out a hand, and somebody gave him a shoulderless shirt and coat. He slipped into them smoothly, Pooh Bah dexterously using its little claws to help put its turret and body through the neatly hemmed holes. The small storm troop looked at Fay with deferential expectation. He held still for a moment, as if thinking, and then walked over to Gusterson and looked him in the face, and again held still. Fay's expression was jaunty on the surface, agonized underneath. Gusterson knew that he wasn't thinking at all, but only listening for instructions from something that was whispering on the very threshold of his inner ear. "Gussie, old boy," Fay said, twitching a depthless grin, "I'd be very much obliged if you'd answer a few simple questions." His voice was hoarse at first, but he swallowed twice and corrected that. "What exactly did you have in mind when you invented the ticklers? What exactly are they supposed to be?" "Why, you miserable—" Gusterson began in a kind of confused horror. Then he got a hold of himself and said curtly, "They were supposed to be mech reminders. They were supposed to record memoranda and—" Fay held up a palm and shook his head and again listened for a space. Then, "That's how ticklers were supposed to be of use to humans," he said. I don't mean that at all. I mean how ticklers were supposed to be of use to themselves. Surely you had some notion." Fay wet his lips. "If it's any help," he added, "keep in mind that it's not Fay who's asking this question, but Pooh Bah." Gusterson hesitated. He had the feeling that every one of the 8 dual beings in the room was hanging on his answer, and that something was boring into his mind, and turning over his next thoughts, and peering at and under them before he had a chance to scan them himself. Pooh Bah's eye was like a red searchlight. "Go on," Fay prompted. "What were ticklers supposed to be for themselves?" "Nothin'," Gusterson said softly. "Nothin' at all." He could feel the disappointment well up in the room, and with it a touch of something like panic.
This time Fay listened for quite a long while. "I hope you don't mean that, Gussie," he said at last, very earnestly. "I mean, I hope you hunt deep and find some ideas you forgot, or maybe never realized you had at the time. Let me put it to you differently. What's the place of ticklers in the natural scheme of things? What's their aim in life, their special reason, their genius, their final cause? What gods should ticklers worship?" But Gusterson was already shaking his head. He said, "I don't know anything about that at all." Fay sighed and gave simultaneously with Pooh Bah the now familiar triple jointed shrug. Then the man briskened himself. "I guess that's as far as we can get right now," he said. "Keep thinking, Gussie. Try to remember something. You won't be able to leave your apartment. I'm setting guards. If you want to see me, tell them. Or just think. In due course you'll be questioned further. In any case, perhaps by special methods, perhaps you'll be ticklerized. That's all. Come on, everybody. Let's get going." The pimply woman and her pal let go of Gusterson. Daisy's man loosened his decorous hold. Davidson and Kester sidled away with an eye behind them, and the little storm troop trudged out. Fay looked back in the doorway. "I'm sorry, Gussie," he said, and for a moment his old self looked out of his eyes. "I wish I could—" A claw reached for his ear. A spasm of pain crossed his face. He stiffened and marched off. The door shut. Gusterson took 2 deep breaths that were close to angry sobs. Then, still breathing stentorously, he stamped into the bedroom. "What?" Daisy asked, looking after him. He came back carrying his .38 and headed for the door. "What are you up to?" she demanded, knowing very well. "I'm going to blast that iron monkey off Fay's back if it's the last thing I do." She threw her arms around him. "Now let me go," Gusterson growled. "I gotta be a man one time, anyway." As they struggled for the gun, the door opened noiselessly. Davidson slipped in and deftly snatched the weapon out of their hands before they realized he was there. He said nothing, only smiled at them and shook his head in sad reproof as he went out. Gusterson slumped. "I knew they were all psionic," he said softly. "I just got out of control now. That last look Fay gave us." He touched Daisy's arm. "Thanks, kid." He walked to the glass wall and looked out desultorily. After a while he turned and said, "Maybe you better be with the kids, eh? I imagine the guards will let you through." Daisy shook her head. "The kids never come home until supper. For the next few hours they'll be safer without me." Gusterson nodded vaguely, sat down on the couch and propped his chin on the base of his palm. After a while his brow smoothed and Daisy knew that the wheels had started to turn inside and the electrons to jump around, except that she reminded herself to permanently cross out those particular figures of speech from her vocabulary. After about half an hour Gusterson said softly, "I think the ticklers are so psionic that it's as if they have just one mind. If I were with them very long I'd start to be part of that mind. Say something to one of them and you say it to all." 15 minutes later. "They're not crazy. They're just newborn. Like ones that were creating a cooching chaos downstairs were like babies, kicking their legs and waving their eyes, trying to see what their bodies could do. Too bad their bodies are us." 10 minutes more. "I gotta do something about it. Fay's right. It's all my fault. He's just the apprentice. I'm the old sorcerer himself." 5 minutes more, gloomily. "Maybe it's man's destiny to build live machines and then bow out of the cosmic picture. Except the ticklers need us, damn it, just like nomads need horses." Another 5 minutes. "Maybe somebody could dream up a purpose in life for the ticklers, even a religion, the first church of Pooh Bah Tickler. But I hate selling other people's spiritual ideas, and that'd still leave ticklers parasitic on humans." As he murmured those last words, Gusterson's eyes got wide as a maniac's, and a big smile reached for his ears. He stood up and faced himself toward the door. "What are you intending to do now?" Daisy asked flatly. "I'm merely going out and save the world," he told her. "I may be back for supper, and I may not." Chapter 8. Davidson pulled out from the wall against which he'd been resting himself and his 2-stone tickler and moved to block the hall. But Gusterson simply walked up to him. He shook his hand warmly and looked his tickler full in the eye and said in a ringing voice, "Ticklers should have bodies of their own." He paused and then added casually, "Come on, let's visit your boss." Davidson listened for instructions and then nodded, but he watched Gusterson warily as they walked down the hall. In the elevator, Gusterson repeated his message to the second guard, who turned out to be the pimply woman, now wearing shoes. This time he added, "Ticklers shouldn't be tied to the frail bodies of humans, which need a lot of thoughtful supervision and drug injecting and can't even fly." Crossing the park, Gusterson stopped a humpbacked soldier and informed him, "Ticklers gotta cut the apron string and snap the silver cord and go out into the universe and find their own purposes." Davidson and the pimply woman didn't interfere. They merely waited and watched and then led Gusterson on. On the escalator, he told someone, "It's cruel to tie ticklers to slow-witted, snaily humans when ticklers can think and live 10,000 times as fast." He finished plucking the figure from the murk of his unconscious. By the time they got to the bottom, the message had become, "Ticklers should have a planet of their own." They never did catch up with Fay, although they spent 2 hours skimming around on sidewalks under the subterranean stars, pursuing rumors of his presence. Clearly the boss tickler, which was how they thought of Pooh Bah, led an energetic life. Gusterson continued to deliver his message to all and sundry at 30-second intervals. Toward the end, he found himself doing it in a dreamy and forgetful way. His mind, he decided, was becoming assimilated to the communal telepathic mind of the ticklers. It did not seem to matter at the time. After 2 hours, Gusterson realized that he and his guides were becoming part of a general movement of people, a flow as mindless as that of blood corpuscles through the veins, yet at the same time dimly purposeful. At least there was the feeling that it was at the behest of a mind far above. The flow was topside. All the sidewalks seemed to lead to the concourses and the escalators. Gusterson found himself part of a human stream, moving into the tickler factory adjacent to his apartment, or another factory very much like it. Thereafter, Gusterson's awarenesses were dimmed. It was as if a bigger mind were doing the remembering for him, and it were permissible and even mandatory for him to dream his way along. He knew vaguely that days were passing. He knew he had work of a sort. At one time he was bringing food to gaunt-eyed, tickler-mounted humans working feverishly in a production line, human hands and tickler claws working together in a blur of rapidity on silvery mechanisms that moved along jumpily on a great belt. At another he was sweeping piles of metal scraps and garbage down a gray corridor. 2 scenes stood out a little more vividly. A windowless wall had been knocked out for 20 feet. There was blue sky outside, its light almost hurtful, and a drop of many stories. A file of humans were being processed. When one of them got to the head of the file, his or her tickler was ceremoniously unstrapped from his shoulder and welded into a silvery cask with smoothly pointed ends. The result was something that looked, at least in the case of the Mark VI ticklers, like a stubby silver submarine, child-size. It would hum gently, lift off the floor, and then fly slowly out through the big blue gap. Then the next tickler-ridden human would step forward for processing. The second scene was in a park, the sky again blue, but big and high, with an argosy of white clouds. Gusterson was lined up in a crowd of humans that stretched as far as he could see, row on irregular row. Martial music was playing. Overhead hovered a flock of little silver submarines, lined up rather more orderly in the air than the humans were on the ground. The music rose to a heart-quickening climax. The tickler nearest Gusterson gave, as if to say, "And now, who knows?" a triple-jointed shrug that stung his memory. Then the ticklers took off, straight up, on their new and shining bodies. They became a flight of silver geese, of silver midges, and the humans around Gusterson lifted a ragged cheer. That scene marked the beginning of the return of Gusterson's mind and memory. He shuffled around a bit, spoke vaguely to 3 or 4 people he recalled from the dream days, and then headed for home and supper, 3 weeks late, and as disoriented and emaciated as a bear coming out of hibernation. 6 months later, Fay was having dinner with Daisy and Gusterson. The cocktails had been poured and the children were playing in the next apartment. The transparent violet walls brightened, then gloomed as the sun dipped below the horizon. Gusterson said, "I see where a spaceship out beyond the orbit of Mars was holed by a tickler. I wonder where the little guys are headed now." Fay started to give a writhing left-arm shrug, but stopped himself with a grimace. "Maybe out of the solar system altogether," suggested Daisy, who'd recently dyed her hair fire engine red and was wearing red leotards. "They got a weary trip ahead of them," Gusterson said, "unless they work out a hyper-Einsteinian drive on the way." Fay grimaced again. He was still looking rather peaked. He said plaintively, "Haven't we heard enough about ticklers for a while?" "I guess so," Gunderson agreed. "But I get to wondering about the little guys. They were so serious and intense about everything. I never did solve their problem, you know. I just shifted it onto other shoulders than ours. No joke intended," he hurried to add. Fay forebode to comment. "By the way, Gussie," he said, "have you heard anything from the Red Cross about that world-saving medal I nominated you for? I know you think the whole concept of world-saving medals is ridiculous, especially when they started giving them to all heads of state who didn't start atomic wars while in office, but—" "Nary a peep," Gusterson told him. "I'm not proud, Fay. I could use a few world-saving medals. I'd start a flurry in the old gold market. But I don't worry about those things. I don't have time to. I'm busy these days thinking up a bunch of new inventions." "Gussie!" Fay said sharply, his face tightening in alarm. "Have you forgotten your promise?" "Course not, Fay. My new inventions aren't for Micro or any other firm. They're just a legitimate part of my literary endeavors. Happens my next insanity novel is going to be about a mad inventor." End of Part 2 of The Creature from Cleveland Depths by Fritz Leiber.